In the previous video, we built a complete Spring Security JWT authentication system. The application works perfectly, but do you know what actually happens after you click the login button? Who verifies your username and password? Who decides whether you're authenticated? And how does Spring Security know who you are before generating a JWT token? In this video, we'll uncover the complete authentication journey inside Spring Security, one step at a time, so you'll understand what's happening behind the scenes, not just how to write the code. Every authentication request begins at the AuthController. When the user clicks the login button, the client sends a POST request containing the username and password to the login API. The AuthController receives this request, but it doesn't check whether the credentials are correct. Instead, it simply passes the login request to the AuthenticationManager. This separation of responsibility keeps the controller focused on handling HTTP requests, while Spring Security takes care of the authentication logic. The AuthenticationManager is the central coordinator of Spring Security authentication. After receiving the login request from the AuthController, it creates an authentication process for the supplied username and password. But here's something many developers don't know. The AuthenticationManager doesn't verify the credentials itself. Instead, it delegates the authentication request to an appropriate authentication provider. Think of it as a manager who assigns the work to the right expert instead of doing the work personally. Once the Authentication Manager delegates the request, the authentication provider takes over and performs the actual authentication. Its first job is to retrieve the user's details. To do that, it calls our CustomUserDetailsService, which uses the UserRepository to search the database by username. If the user exists, it returns a user details object containing the username, encrypted password, and roles. If no matching user is found, Spring Security immediately rejects the login request with a username not found exception. After the authentication provider loads the user's details, the next step is to verify the password. This is the job of the PasswordEncoder. Spring Security typically uses bcrypt PasswordEncoder, which stores passwords as one-way hashes instead of plain text. During login, Spring Security hashes the password entered by the user and compares it with the hashed password stored in the database. If the hashes match, authentication succeeds. Otherwise, Spring Security throws a bad credentials exception and the login request is rejected. Once the user's credentials are successfully verified, Spring Security creates an authentication object containing the user's details and authorities. It then stores this object inside the security context holder. Think of the security context holder as a secure container that keeps information about the currently authenticated user for the duration of the request. Whenever your application needs to know who is making the request, Spring Security retrieves the user's information directly from the security context holder instead of asking the user to log in again. After the user is successfully authenticated, the Authentication Manager returns an authenticated authentication object. Our auth service then calls the JWT service to generate a JWT token using the authenticated user's information. The token contains claims such as the username, issued time, and expiration time, and it is digitally signed to prevent tampering. Finally, the JWT is returned to the client. The client stores this token and sends it in the authorization header as a bearer token with every future request. Let's bring the entire authentication process together. The client sends a login request to the AuthController, which forwards it to the Authentication Manager. The Authentication Manager delegates the request to the authentication provider, which loads the user through the CustomUserDetailsService and verifies the password using the PasswordEncoder. Once authentication succeeds, Spring Security stores the authenticated user in the security context holder. Finally, the JWT service generates a signed JWT token and returns it to the client. In the next video, we'll discover what happens when the client sends this JWT with every request, and how Spring Security validates it before allowing access to protected APIs. If you found this helpful, like, subscribe, and share.